My beloved child. Something happened when your photo appeared in front of two people who know this person very well. It was not planned the way you might imagine. There was no grand announcement. No dramatic moment. Just a picture. Your picture. And for a few seconds, the room seemed to become strangely quiet. Why? What did they notice first? Was it your eyes? Your expression? The way you carried yourself without even trying? Or was there something about you that reminded them of a story they had already heard? You may never know what happened in that moment. But there was a reaction. And the interesting part is this. Neither of them looked at your photo in exactly the same way. One became curious. The other became unusually thoughtful. You might wonder why that matters. Because sometimes people reveal more through a pause than through 100 words. And that pause happened here. Perhaps you have felt something changing around this connection. Perhaps conversations became quieter. Perhaps there were moments when you felt this person was thinking about you, but you could not understand why. Maybe you even questioned whether you mattered as much as you once believed. But what you could not see was a conversation happening somewhere outside your view. And your name was connected to it. Stay with this thought for a moment. Because the first opinion was not what you might expect. One of the friends looked at your picture longer than the other. Not because something was wrong. Quite the opposite. There was something familiar in your expression. Something calm. Something that made them ask a simple question. Who is this? That question may sound small. But sometimes a small question opens a much bigger door. The person who showed them your photo did not answer right away. There was hesitation. A quiet smile. Almost as if they were trying to decide how much they should reveal. You see. There are feelings that people protect with silence. And sometimes a picture makes that silence harder to maintain. One friend then shared an opinion. It was direct. It was honest. And it made the person holding the phone suddenly look away. Why? What could possibly have been said about you that created that reaction? You may be expecting something simple. Maybe a compliment. Maybe a comment about your appearance. But this story goes deeper than that. Because the second friend noticed something completely different. And their words carried a strange weight. They did not focus on the picture alone. They focused on what they believed was behind the picture. Your energy. Your expression. The feeling they sensed from the person who was showing them your photo. And that is where this quiet conversation began to change. You may have spent days wondering what this person truly thinks about you. You may have asked yourself whether they speak about you when you are not there. Perhaps you wondered if their friends know more than they ever told you. Now imagine sitting somewhere far away. Not hearing the conversation. Not seeing the faces. Not knowing that your photo is sitting on a phone between them. And then hearing one sentence that makes everyone go quiet. That sentence was coming. But before it was spoken, something unexpected happened. One of the friends asked another question. A question about you. Not about your appearance. Not about your past. About the connection itself. And that question revealed that they had already noticed something. Something the person in your story had been trying very hard not to explain. The next piece is where this becomes personal. Because their strongest opinion about you was not based on your picture at all. It was based on the way this person reacted when your picture appeared. And that reaction said more than words ever could. You will understand why soon. Because there was one detail in that moment that neither friend could ignore. And once they noticed it, the conversation took a completely different direction. That is where the next layer begins. The second friend looked at the picture again. This time, more carefully. There was no joke. No casual comment. Just a quiet look. Then came a question that changed the mood completely. Why does this person matter so much to you? Nobody answered immediately. And that silence was important. Because sometimes the truth does not arrive through a confession. Sometimes it appears in the space between one question and the answer. The person holding your photo looked down. For a moment, they seemed almost caught off guard. As if they had been asked something they were not ready to say out loud. You might think they would simply laugh it off. Maybe change the subject. Maybe pretend it was nothing. But they didn't. They stayed quiet. And one of the friends noticed. You see, your picture had become more than a picture. It had become a mirror. A mirror showing what this person tried to hide. And the two friends were watching closely. One of them smiled softly and said something that sounded simple. But it carried much more meaning than it seemed. They said that you did not look like someone who was trying to impress anyone. That observation stayed in the room. Because there was something about your expression that felt natural. Unforced. Real. And perhaps that is why the comment landed differently. You may have spent a long time wondering whether people truly see you. Not the version you show when everything is fine. Not the version that smiles when your heart feels tired. But the real you. The quiet you. The person who has learned to keep certain feelings private. That was the version they seemed to notice. And then the first friend said something else. Something more personal. They wondered whether this person had ever told you what they actually thought. That question created another silence. Because the answer was complicated. There were things that had been felt but never explained. Thoughts that had been carried but never spoken. Words that had almost been sent. Then deleted. Conversations that had almost happened. Then stopped. Maybe you know that feeling. You hold your phone. You see someone's name. You wonder if you should say something. Then you put the phone down. Not because you do not care. Sometimes you stop because you care too much. And this was the kind of silence these friends seemed to recognize. But there was still something they did not know. Something even the person in the story had not fully understood about themselves. One friend looked at the photo again. Then they looked at the person beside them. And their expression changed. They had reached a different conclusion. Not about your beauty. Not about your style. Not about anything visible. They were thinking about the effect you seemed to have on someone. And that was much harder to explain. Because a person can forget a face. They can forget a conversation. But they do not easily forget how someone made them feel. That was the hidden subject of the conversation. You. Not the photo. Not the image on the screen. You. The memory of you. The feeling connected to you. The questions that appeared whenever your name came up. And then came the part that neither friend expected. The person showing your picture finally spoke. Their voice was quieter than before. They admitted that there was something about you they could not easily explain. Not because you had done something dramatic. Not because you had chased them. Not because you had demanded their attention. It was almost the opposite. Your distance had made them think. Your silence had made them wonder. Your presence had left a mark without asking permission. And one friend immediately understood what that meant. But they did not say it yet. Instead, they asked one final question. If you feel this strongly, why haven't you told them? That question landed differently. Because now the conversation was no longer about your photo. It was about the space between two people. The things left unsaid. The fear of saying too much. And the possibility that one honest conversation could change everything. You may be wondering what answer came next. But there is something you need to notice first. Neither friend told this person to forget you. Neither one laughed at the connection. Neither one dismissed what they had seen. Instead, they became more curious. And one of them quietly said something about you that made the person holding your picture look away again. It was not a warning. It was not criticism. It was an observation. A simple sentence. Yet somehow, it touched the exact place this person had been trying to hide. And that sentence is where the next layer begins. Because the strongest opinion about you was still waiting to be spoken. And when it finally surfaced, it was not really about your appearance at all. It was about who they believed you were underneath it. The part they could not see from a picture. The part they somehow sensed anyway. And that is where your story becomes even more personal. For a moment, nobody said anything. Your picture was still there. Quietly sitting on the screen. But the conversation had moved far beyond the photo. One of the friends leaned back and looked at the person beside them. Then they said something that made the room feel different. You seem different when you talk about them. That was it. A simple sentence. But it exposed something that had been sitting beneath every word. The person did not argue. They did not laugh. They simply looked down. And sometimes, silence is the answer people give when the truth feels too close. You may have experienced moments like that in your own life. Someone says your name. Someone mentions a memory. And suddenly, the person who seemed completely calm becomes quiet. Maybe you have wondered why. Maybe you thought you imagined it. But in this story, someone else noticed it too. Someone who was not emotionally involved. Someone watching from the outside. And that made their opinion different. The first friend had already formed an impression of you from the photo. But now they were forming another impression from the reaction. They began to wonder if there was more history between you than they had been told. Not necessarily a dramatic history. Sometimes the deepest connections are built through small moments. A conversation. A look. A missed opportunity. A message that was never sent. A moment when two people wanted to say something. But neither knew how. That kind of unfinished story can stay in the heart for a long time. And perhaps that is what these friends were beginning to sense. One of them looked at your picture once more. Then they said something unexpected. They said you looked like someone who had learned not to beg for attention. That comment created another pause. Because it was not really about your face. It was about the feeling behind it. There was a quiet strength in the way you seemed to carry yourself. Not loud. Not forced. Just present. And the person who cared about you seemed to recognize that immediately. You may not realize how powerful that can be. Sometimes the person who says the least leaves the deepest impression. Sometimes the one who walks away without making a scene becomes the one people cannot stop thinking about. And sometimes, the absence of someone makes their presence even clearer. That was becoming obvious now. But then the second friend asked something more difficult. Do they know how you feel? The question stayed in the air. The person looked at your picture. Their expression softened. And for a few seconds, it seemed like they might finally answer honestly. But they stopped. They said they did not know. Maybe they believed you had moved on. Maybe they thought you no longer cared. Maybe they were afraid that reaching out would disturb a peace you had worked hard to build. You see, people can create entire stories in their minds when they do not have the courage to ask one simple question. And sometimes those stories keep two people apart. The friends seemed to understand this. They did not pressure the person. They simply listened. Then one of them said something that changed the conversation again. They said, maybe you're not supposed to figure them out from a picture. That sentence was quiet. But it carried weight. Because a photograph can show a face. It can show a smile. It can show an expression. But it cannot show everything. It cannot show the nights you stayed strong when nobody knew. It cannot show the battles you fought silently. It cannot show the kindness you gave when you received very little in return. It cannot show how deeply you feel. And perhaps that was the most important thing these friends were beginning to understand. They were not really judging your picture. They were trying to understand the person behind it. And the more they listened, the more their opinions seemed to shift. Not because someone convinced them. Because they were noticing something genuine. Something they could not easily name. Then came another moment. The person holding your picture smiled. It was not a big smile. Just a small one. But both friends noticed it. And one of them immediately said, "There." Just one word. The person looked confused. The friend continued. "That smile." Suddenly, everyone became quiet again. Because they had noticed what happened when your picture was in front of them. The person had changed. Their face softened. Their voice became lighter. Their attention stayed on the screen longer than necessary. And that tiny reaction told the friends more than any explanation could. You may wonder what they said next. But that is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because one friend had formed a strong opinion about you. And the other had formed a completely different one. Neither opinion was negative. But neither was simple. One believed you were stronger than you appeared. The other believed you had affected this person's heart more deeply than they wanted to admit. And then, they both reached the same question. What happens if the person in the picture already knows? What happens if you have felt this connection too? What happens if the silence between you was never the end? Those questions were never answered. Instead, the conversation ended with one final look at your photo. And before the phone was put away, one friend said something that stayed in the person's mind long after the conversation was over. A sentence about you. A sentence that sounded almost like advice. And perhaps it was the one thing this person needed to hear. But what exactly did that friend say? That part was never spoken loudly. It was said quietly. And the meaning behind those words is where the next chapter begins. The room had become quiet again. Your picture was still on the screen. But nobody was looking at it casually anymore. There was a different feeling now. The two friends had stopped trying to decide what you looked like. They were trying to understand what you meant. And that is a very different question. One of them looked at the person beside them and said softly, "Maybe you should stop wondering whether they care. And start asking yourself why you still care this much." No one laughed. No one changed the subject. The words simply stayed there. And you can imagine what that must have felt like. Because sometimes another person can see something in us that we have spent months avoiding. Maybe this person had convinced themselves that everything was under control. Maybe they had told themselves that your picture meant nothing. Maybe they had tried to place you inside a simple memory. Someone from the past. Someone they once knew. Someone they could think about without feeling anything. But the reaction did not match the story they had created. Their friends had seen that. And now, they could not pretend they had not. You may have wondered whether people notice the quiet things about you. The way you become silent when something matters. The way you step back instead of forcing your way into someone's life. The way you can care deeply without asking for attention. One of the friends seemed to notice exactly that. They said you looked like someone who would rather walk away than lose your self-respect. That sentence hit differently. Because it was not just praise. It was a reminder. And perhaps this person suddenly realized something. Your silence may not have meant that you stopped caring. It may have meant that you stopped chasing an answer. There is a difference. A powerful difference. And maybe That difference was finally becoming clear. The second friend picked up the phone again. They looked at your picture for another moment. Then they said, "I don't think they're trying to prove anything." The person beside them nodded slowly. That observation seemed to matter. Because there was something natural about you. Something that did not look like performance. You were not trying to appear mysterious. You were not trying to make anyone jealous. You were not trying to create a reaction. You simply existed. And somehow, that was enough to create one. Your image had brought up memories. Your name had brought up questions. And now the friends were beginning to understand that the real story was not what they had expected. It was not about whether you were attractive. It was about why your presence still had emotional weight. You may have felt that weight yourself. Maybe there are moments when a certain song reminds you of someone. Maybe a familiar place suddenly brings back an old conversation. Maybe you see something ordinary and remember a person you thought you had forgotten. That does not always mean you should return to the past. Sometimes it simply means the past mattered. And that was the feeling growing inside this conversation. Not certainty. Not a promise. Just recognition. Something had mattered. And neither friend wanted to dismiss it. Then one of them asked the question that changed everything again. If you could tell them one thing right now, what would it be? The person holding your photo became still. Their eyes stayed on the screen. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then they began to speak. Not quickly. Not confidently. Almost as if the words had been waiting for permission. They said there were things they wished they had handled differently. Things they wished they had explained. Things they wished you understood. But they stopped before saying more. That pause was important. Because the most honest feelings are sometimes the hardest to finish. And perhaps you know that feeling. You have something in your heart. You want to say it. But once the words leave you, everything changes. So you keep them inside. You wait. You hope the other person somehow understands. The friends listened. They did not interrupt. And then the first friend looked at your picture one final time. This time, their opinion was clear. They said you seemed like someone worth being honest with. Not because you were perfect. Not because the future was guaranteed. But because pretending not to care was clearly making things harder. The person holding your photo looked away. And for the first time that evening, they seemed to accept that truth. You might expect that to be the ending. It was not. Because one more thing happened after the conversation should have been over. The phone was placed on the table. The friends began talking about something else. But this person picked up the phone again. They looked at your picture. And this time, they did not scroll away. They simply stared. As if they were seeing you differently. Not as a photograph. Not as a memory. But as someone standing on the other side of everything that had never been said. And somewhere in that quiet moment, a decision seemed to form. Not a dramatic decision. Not a promise. Just a small inner shift. The kind nobody else can see. The kind that begins before any action ever happens. You may never know exactly what they thought in that moment. But perhaps you do not need to know everything. Because sometimes the most important change happens quietly. Before the message. Before the conversation. Before the next chapter. And just when this person was about to put the phone away, one of the friends said something else. A final sentence. A sentence that made them stop. And this time, it was not about your appearance. It was not about the past. It was about what they believed you deserved. The words were simple. But they opened a door that neither of them had expected to walk through. And what waits behind that door? is where the story remains unfinished. The room had almost returned to normal. The conversation should have ended. Your picture should have disappeared from the screen. But one sentence remained hanging in the air. You should be honest with them. Simple words. Yet the person holding your picture did not move. They looked down at the phone. Then back at their friend. There was no argument. No excuse. Just a long, quiet pause. Because deep inside, they already knew what the friend was talking about. Not a promise. Not a future that anyone could guarantee. Just honesty. The kind that had been missing for too long. And maybe that is what you needed to hear too. You do not have to force someone to understand your worth. You do not have to chase an explanation. You do not have to prove that your feelings were real. Sometimes people recognize your value only after they stop hearing your voice. Only after the noise disappears. Only after they are left alone with their own thoughts. And that may have been happening here. The first friend looked at the photo again. Then came another observation. They look peaceful. The person beside them smiled faintly. But the friend continued. Don't mistake that peace for not caring. Those words landed deeply. Because there is a difference between being peaceful and being unaffected. You can care deeply. And still choose yourself. You can miss someone. And still keep walking. You can remember a connection. Without losing your direction. Perhaps that was the strongest impression these two friends had formed about you. Not that you were perfect. Not that you had everything figured out. But that you seemed to carry something quietly powerful. Self-respect. And that is not always obvious in a photograph. It is something people sense. Something they notice in the way a person carries themselves. Something they remember after the picture is gone. The second friend became quiet. Then they said something even more direct. If they really matter to you, don't wait forever for the perfect moment. Again. Silence. Because perfect moments rarely come. People wait for the right words. The right timing. The right sign. The right feeling. And while they wait, life keeps moving. You may have experienced this yourself. You think. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow I will speak. Maybe tomorrow I will explain. Maybe tomorrow I will finally say what I feel. But tomorrow becomes another tomorrow. And eventually, silence becomes a habit. That was the fear these friends seemed to recognize. Not that something terrible would happen. Something much quieter. That two people might care. And still remain apart because neither one was willing to be honest. The person looked at your photo again. This time, there was no smile. There was something deeper. Reflection. Perhaps regret. Perhaps hope. Perhaps simply the realization that you were not waiting in the same place anymore. And that thought seemed to matter. Because you had your own life. Your own dreams. Your own path. Your own healing. You were not standing still just because someone else was uncertain. And maybe that was exactly what made your presence feel different. You had not demanded to be chosen. You had simply continued becoming yourself. One friend noticed the change in expression. They did not ask another question. They simply said. Then don't tell them what you think they want to hear. The person looked up. The friend continued. Tell them what is true. That sentence changed the atmosphere again. Because honesty can be frightening. But uncertainty can be exhausting. And perhaps this person had been carrying both. They wanted to know what you thought. They wanted to know whether you still cared. They wanted to know if the door between you was completely closed. But they had been afraid to ask. And now, Their friends had placed the question directly in front of them. You. Your photo. Your memory. Your silence. All of it. For the first time, they were being forced to look at the connection without hiding behind excuses. And then something unexpected happened. The person opened the conversation connected to your name. Their thumb hovered over the screen. They did not type. Not yet. They simply looked. Maybe they were remembering the last time you spoke. Maybe they were remembering something you said. Maybe they were wondering whether you would even want to hear from them. You might think the next step is obvious. But it was not. Because one of the friends noticed the hesitation. And instead of telling them what to do, they said something much wiser. Don't reach out because you're afraid of losing them. Reach out only if you're ready to be real. The room became silent. Those words carried no pressure. No promise. Just truth. And perhaps that is why they mattered. The person placed the phone down. Not because they had given up. Because they were thinking. Really thinking. And somewhere inside that quiet moment, something had changed. Your photo had started a conversation. But the conversation had uncovered something much larger. It had forced someone to look at feelings they had avoided. It had shown two friends a side of you they had never personally known. And it had left one unanswered question sitting between everyone. If the truth was finally becoming clear to them, would they ever have the courage to let you hear it? That question remained unanswered. And maybe that is where the most important part of this story begins. Because the next moment was not about what the friends thought of you. It was about what this person finally admitted to themselves. When nobody else was listening.